here now with you to share with you something that at least I personally consider to be an important discovery. My memory in this case goes back to the late 1950s when I first arrived in this land, and then also in this particular place, and I was beginning to assemble my initial nuclear library of H.P. Blavatsky, and I desired to do that more or less chronologically. So one of the very first books that I bought and subsequently studied was Isis Unveiled. Isis Unveiled was also not that readily available in the European countries where I lived. Well, the secret doctrine was, but I said I am going to deal with these in chronological order of their authorship. So I bought my nice big, and I still have it somewhere among my innumerable books. I moved on to Isis Unveiled, and as I read, actually, as I recall, because that was really a long time ago, it was in the early part of even that huge book, I discovered a reference by H.P. Blavatsky of the Babylonian Kabbalah. And I knew a little bit about Cabala already, but I thought to myself, well, Babylonian, well, that'll be interesting. And of course, most of us only know a little bit of Babylon about the Bible, or maybe some poets who referred to the waters of Babylon in English literature. And as I now learned, it is also referred to in a roundabout way in Isis Unveiled. And so I read all of Isis Unveiled, which is a fantastically interesting book, as indeed is The Secret Doctrine, which, however, does not, to my knowledge, does not contain the subject that I am reluctantly discoursing about right now. So in any event, I said, well, Babylonian Kabbalah, I wonder what the heck that is. And so I'm still wondering, but now I think I have come closer to a possible explanation. And that's what I'll give to you right now. The Cabala, of course, is a Jewish esoteric work that has been altered and adapted many times, and which is referred to and described by various Hebraic sages as being of a certain pattern, and that pattern we may refer to, if you don't mind, to memorize that, although many of you have probably already, the Lurianic Kabbalah, because there in the Western world, west of the Mediterranean, there was a Kabbalistic Jewish wise man, Rabbi Isaac Luria Ashkenazi, which means that he was an Ashkenazi by family, and the Ashkenazi Jews were the Eastern Jews, including Spain and Portugal and North Africa. So that just indicates as to what part of the world he was raised in. and that is the Kabbalah that most people refer to, including some really very interesting works like the mystical Kabbalah by Dion Fortune, a great Kabbalist and mystic, and many others. So I said, well, interesting, now referring to a very distant location from the places where the Lurianic Kabbalah was written, and where exegetical literature concerning it was also authored. So let's take a look and see what we are talking about here. And other than H.P. Blavatsky's reference, it wasn't very long, I couldn't find a doggone thing. So I says, good heavens, where was or is or will be a Babylonian Kabbalah? And if it is indeed, then what is it like? So as I went on with Secret Doctrine itself, various Blavatsky works, and Cabalistic literature, I gradually uncovered some elements which I hope that you will be able to make sense of, because I often don't know how to make sense of my own ideas. So perhaps all of us together can deal with it. In any event, first of all, let's try to clarify the terms. Babylonian Kabbalah. Babylon was a very long-lived and very important empire, beginning in the sort of the central part of the Mid-East, where now Iraq is located, more or less, and extending, depending on the particular historical period, clear down to the Indian Ocean. Various important people who have become very important to the Western tradition have journeyed to Babylon, one of them being, let's see, who was I thinking of? Well, Alexander the Great, who got everywhere where his troops would carry him, and we shall refer to him a little bit later this week, like maybe next Friday, and various other people. All right, we know vaguely as to what they are talking about. Then, of course, you could also just go into, I don't know, Gerson's. Is it Gerson or the big grocery store in our neighborhood? The Gerson's market, and then you would find that there are references to Babylon, especially if you run into one of those dear people whom I really like greatly, the Rastafarians. The Rastafarians, of course, are a religious group originating in and devoted very largely to Ethiopia and to the late and lamented Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie I, who was always a favorite of mine. When I was just a little boy, the Italians, you know, that great martial people that gets beat sooner than anybody else on on the battlefield, and I hope there is nobody here who will take exception to that. But let's say the Italians under Mussolini, of course Mussolini stayed in Rome where he was safe, understandably, but I think it was probably the Marshal Badoglio who led the Italian troops into Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was also called. And I was a little boy, and we were talking about that because the first conversation of the day in our family was always pretty much about the newspaper. And then when I learned how to read at my father's directions, then it was the newspaper. It's the first thing when we were way out in the country in northern Hungary or Czechoslovakia, depending on how the wheels were turning at that time. And so my father would make me bring the newspaper into him, and then he said, "All right, son, now we are going to read the paper, but I don't know how." "Oh, come on, just sit down and I'll show you." And so we started out with the big black headlines, and next day another headline, and among them very soon we discovered that the Italians had invaded Ethiopia, and that the Negus, as at least he was called in my country, the emperor of Ethiopia, had to flee, but that he went to England and he hoped to come back at the head of British troops. In any event, I wrote to him and I said, "Dear Your Majesty, dear Negus," in Hungarian, which I'm sure he had more than a difficult time reading if he ever tried. But in any event, I said, we have learned that you have been attacked by another country. We want you to know that we pray for you every time we are in church, and that we consider you as a great friend of our country and of our people. Well, time went by, and all of a sudden I got a letter from Budapest, from the Ethiopian consulate. And it said in it that the communication that you addressed to His Majesty the Negus has been received, and that he was greatly moved by your good thoughts and wishes and prayers for him and for his country. And of course, he was a very highly regarded romantic figure. Let me just tell you one other one. When finally the British decided that they would go back and retake Ethiopia, then he got on his in just a rumpled suit bought somewhere in London, probably not for a great deal of money. He got on the airplane with the various British officers, and they flew to Ethiopia. And when they arrived there, he said, "I would like a few minutes, gentlemen, for me to go to the bathroom." So they got off the plane. They were already in Addis Ababa, the capital city, and he went into that particular location. Took him quite a while to come out, but everybody turned his head because the rumpled, cheap English suit was no longer visible, but the field marshal uniform of Ethiopia with all the medals that he has received, that was there, and his weapon at his side, and he said, "Gentlemen, now let's go." and they proceeded and they took Ethiopia from the Axis, shall we say, which all pleased us very greatly. And my father said, you see, we placed our confidence in somebody very interesting and very wonderful, and so it was. So I'm not going to go into too many more little anecdotes that were collected while he was in London and so forth. For instance, he went into the British Museum. Anybody who knows where to go in London has to go to the British Museum. Then you can go to Buckingham Palace and other places. Anyway, he went to the British Museum, always accompanied by some official, foreign office official, no doubt. And he came to a particular case of glass, and he looked at the inscription, and he pointed to the contents of the glass, and he said, gentlemen, I would like you to remove these objects because they are mine. So some decades earlier, his grandfather, Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia, had run-in with the British Foreign Office, and the British troops came, and among the booty that they took were some crown jewels and medals and so forth of the Negus, the empire. And so he said, will you be so kind to arrange to have these packed up, that when I go home I'm going to take them with me? Yes, Majesty. And so those were some of the uniforms that he donned when he arrived in Ethiopia. And of course, at that time, things were still going well, and Ethiopia was wrested from the claws of Mussolini, and the Negus, the emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie I, went back to his capital city. And in his capital city, by the way, clear until the communists murdered him, there were lions in the garden, just like you would have dogs walking around, and they were on golden chains. So I greatly regret that I never got there, and I was too little in those times, but to see the lions walking in the Ethiopian garden on golden chains would have been something to remember till the day of my death. And of course the Rastafarians, who are African people living in sort of the edge of Ethiopia, not very far from them. The Rastafarian religion originated there, and they regarded him as a divine being. So that when he came to America, for instance, to the funeral of President Kennedy, to which just about everybody, I can just remember him like yesterday, climbing down the runway of the airplane as he arrived, carrying his little poodle dog, and down below were the officials, American officials, but also a goodly group of Rastafarians bowing and making the sign of the cross. So Ethiopia, as a remnant of the earlier great places, such as the one that we are going to talk about, were an important place. And so when we talk about Babylon, the Rastafarians remember Babylon as written in the Bible, because it was one of the several places to which the poor Jewish people were abducted as slaves. Egypt being one, Babylon being another one, various others. And so when the Rastafarians today refer to the unpleasant characteristics of this world, they always say, oh, all is Babylon, man, all is Babylon. And I always salute them because they have pictures of Haile Selassie on their jackets, and they said, the great emperor Haile Selassie said, yes, and the divine man. So in any event, that's a good little romantic entry into the subject, but we are, I think, for the most part interested in an earlier period of history, which has apparently, according to all indications, produced what we might call the Babylonian Kabbalah. Now, before we can go to the Babylonian Kabbalah, we have to just very quickly scan the Kabbalah as we know it. The word Cabala is a Hebrew word of ancient Hebrew, and it is a word composed of all certain kinds of letters, namely consonants, and means, in terms of its intellectual meaning, in terms of its translation, it means that which is handed on. Now, why should that be there? Curious impression. Because that was for a long time the only source of religious literature of the Jewish people, wherever they happened to be, whether they were in Ethiopia, or whether they were in Palestine, or whether they were anywhere else, including the Ashkenazic Jews, as they were referred to in Eastern Europe, where especially the Polish kings tend to favor them. Probably the only person who looked with a great deal of kindness and goodwill toward the Jews, Sigismund the Strong. And he had more than 80 illegitimate sons. So he was called Sigismund the Strong, not without good reason. He's the one who helped to move a lot of German Jews who already at that time were looked askance at and sometimes persecuted in Germany to Poland. And that is the origin of the Polish Jews. Where in all these places that the Jewish people had to journey, almost always par force, as we call it in French, by necessity, we don't know. But certainly the Kabbalah, that religious material that was handed on, not written down for a very long time, that occurred probably in Poland. Because I have a little bit of acquaintance with it, because a lot of Polish Jewish people, as the various wars came on and pogroms, which is a way of periodic persecution of the Jewish communities and so forth, so that a lot of Jewish people, especially of the Hasidic sect, would flee and come to Hungary. This would, of course, be long before Hitler. And my father also always told me, when you see those men with the big hats and the long pointed beards, then you always be very nice to them, because they are the wisest and the holiest people in our land. Here is a big Catholic nobleman lauding the Jews. And actually, until that miserable guy with the little brush under his nose, came on the scene, there was certainly in Eastern Europe, Hungary included, Hungary, Transylvania, Yugoslavia, I'm not going to recount them all, the Jewish people were welcomed. So this was an unfortunate, terrible turn of events, we have to remember. As somewhere among all of that, the Eastern Jewish people were referred to as the Ashkenazim, while the, it's Eastern European. And then there were, of course, the North African and Spanish and Portuguese Jews who were different. They even had a different language among themselves, and they still do. And that, let me see now, it sounds very much like Portuguese. It's a Latin language mixed with Hebrew. If you want to see a strange linguistic cocktail, that's it. In any event, those were really the two great groups after the diaspora. The diaspora is when, under Roman pressure, when Titus, the son of Vespasian, the emperor, Titus was only a general at that time, broke into Palestine and pretty much chased out all the people from there. So there's practically, if you look at all the Hebrew records of wars or so, Palestine had practically always been in war. The word Palestinia, by the way, is Roman in origin and was given to that part of the world by Titus, who later on became emperor. Because I'm just mentioning it because now there are rumors, say, oh well, that was the name of the original inhabitants of that country. There's no evidence of that. It's Titus, the Roman emperor, subsequent emperor, who names the country Palestinia in Latin, and it maintained that name ever after. All right, now let's move on from there. So let us say then, the Jews over a period of time, and when I say periods of time, there's hundreds of years this way and that way, the Jews over a period of time developed a special approach to their religion, which of course is very ancient in nature and very unusual in character. And among these approaches, there came about a religious doctrine and activity which came to be called the Cabala. And it was called, as I alluded to, it was called Cabala because it was not in the Bible. It was not even in the commentaries, the Mishnah. or any other Jewish scripture. It was strictly handed on, and that's why it came to be called the Kabbalah. Now, all right, that being the case, then there came various wise rabbis, both in the West and in the East, who worked with this material, and yes, they occasionally wrote down some passages of scripture which appeared to them to be either closely related to Kabbalah and its teachings, or in otherwise just referring to mystical Judaism. So, as time went on, of course, the Jewish people were ever more dispersed. This is the diaspora, which is really a Greco-Roman term for dispersal. Although, no doubt, some remained in Palestine, and then in our times, you will remember that they reconstituted their ancient country, and that is how the state of Israel was founded. On the day of the day of the founding of the state of Israel, I want you to know we had a party in this room. So you can't accuse the Theosophists of being anti-Semitic. They may be anti-this and anti-that, but not that. And for that matter, I also pride myself as a Hungarian, because I don't know whether you remember his name, because it was before all of our times, but the founding theoretician of the state of Israel, who was really the doctrinal father of the state of Israel, was a man named Theodor Herzl, who, good German-sounding Jewish name, who was a Hungarian small businessman Jew, and he had this idea that the Jews are never going to have anything decent and any peace in the world until they have their own country. So he called the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland. And they said, well, Mr. Herzl, why in Switzerland? Because everywhere else there may be some people who want to persecute us. The Swiss have more important things to do, and they did. Well, like spawning a man like Carl Jung and the various bankers and all of that, the Swiss knew how to deal with things, and they still do. Amazing people. In any event, so that was the founding of Zionism, and Zionism was the founding of the state of Israel. All right, now we got that far. So what then came to pass, we all know, and it ended in the terrible Holocaust, as it has been called, primarily because the manner of disposing of the dead bodies of the Jewish killed in these horrible camps was always a fire. So they cremated the bodies. The people who are very much interested in turning it into a horror story, although it doesn't have to be turned, the Nazis knew how to do that themselves, was really that the people who were not even yet quite dead, or they had inhaled the gas and they were dying, were then thrown into the ovens where they perished by fire. That's a pretty horrible story. In any way, that's why that killing is referred to as the Holocaust, which is a fire. But now let's go a little further. What happened until then? Well, for one thing, the Jewish people were, and many of them still are, except in a godless culture in which they have been catapulted, including in America, that they were very anxious to somehow get hold of their ancient traditions and their ancient religion. I can very well understand that because I'm an exile of many years myself, and one of the real helpful things in the life of the exile, as indeed of many other people who have come on bad times in life, is religion. Religion. Why? Because as the very Latin word religio says it, religio means to be joined back to something. And so what do the Jewish people want to be joined back to? Their God. The God who was, according to their beliefs, was with them for hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of years. And then, as they were exiled from Palestine and things like that, where are we going to find it? And so the religious life, the mystical life, as indeed one scholar wrote a book about them, grew and became more and more important in Jewish life. And I mention this not because I'm Jewish, I'm not. And no one, not that I would be particularly disturbed by it, especially if some good sums of money came along with it, which did not happen. But let's say we had Jewish people dispersed all over Poland, all over Hungary, Transylvania, Yugoslavia, what became Czechoslovakia and so forth. And they were, at least from what we could discern, and I as a little boy could discern, they were all real good citizens. They were all real honest people, and they were good businessmen, and of course with all of that they obviously made some money, but they were also benefactors and the workers of charities very much in Hungary. The city of Budapest way back in the Renaissance period, more or less, had more Jewish than Hungarian inhabitants. Why? Because they came there and they made out nicely. And you know, it's a funny thing, but if you go to a new country and you really prosper there, the likelihood is you're going to stay there. You're not going to go someplace else where they're going to beat you up, among other things. So that is why we had a large Jewish population in Budapest, for instance, in the capital city, and it was actually more Germanic in tone than anything else. In other words, there was one German language newspaper in Budapest, and it was the Jewish paper, the Pestor Lloyd. And many other things were owing to the fact that especially the city of Budapest was heavily populated by a Jewish community, and it redounded to the benefit of Budapest because they brought business and they brought activity and industries and work and so forth. And the one beautiful synagogue, the so-called Dohány utca synagogue, which Dohány means tobacco. So it's the tobacco street. And there is the only medieval Jewish synagogue in Budapest. In Prague you have several. Although I say there was a substantial Jewish community in Budapest too. So anyway, these were the exiles living in other countries, but except for a few bad occasions, they were liked by the people. They were regarded as very important citizens, and they were the only people whom my father always saluted when he, especially the Hasidim, when he saw them walking on the street, because he said, "Son, they may look like they are foreigners, but they are the best Hungarians of them all." And then, of course, German pressure, what did we do? But we have to collaborate with the killers. But in any event, that's not what we are about to talk about. But let's say it was an important nationality, which eventually contributed to all kinds of industrial and financial developments, whereas, for instance, the Jewish community is often associated in the public mind with the house of Rothschild. Rothschild means red. What do the Indians and the Zulus have when they go into a shield? A red shield. That is the house of Rothschild. And they became first quite important in England, but subsequently also in other places, such as in Austria, where the Rothschild family was the first Jewish family receiving a title, a fairly high title of nobility, the Baron Rothschild. And then the Rothschild family spread to their banking houses in all kinds of countries, in Italy, in Spain, various places which had been noted for not treating the Jewish people too well, but they were all over the place. That is the Emperor Franz Joseph, who was always very concerned with treating all of his subjects well. He said, "These are my people. Don't you do anything to my people." But of course, the dear old gentleman was dead by the time. Originally an Austrian-born criminal by the name of Adolf Hitler came to take the helm. So anyway, now what we have to keep in other words, the Jewish people were widely spread. They generally were fairly well-to-do because of their commercial interests and their commercial nature. And at least, I was born in 1931, so let's say in my lifetime, the only time I saw hostility toward the Jewish people was under the influence and the conquest of Hitler. Now, those are the external parameters. But considering in conjunction with these external parameters, there were also interesting religious development, such as the Hasidim, which means the pious ones, and you have some of them still, Hasidic communities in the United States, in New York, and in Los Angeles, and so forth. And they are very anxious to maintain their own sectarian traditions. So when there is a Shabbos, Saturday, the holy day, if you see in certain parts of Los Angeles, Hasidic gentlemen walking along with their long frock coats, their beautiful buckled shoes, and their caps on their heads, then you know that these are the pious ones, the ones who kept themselves aside even officially from other Jews, because they considered themselves as the real Jewish people, because they knew how to pray, they built the synagogues, they were really working at it, let's put it that way. All right. Now, in the midst of all of this, in different countries and in different ways, there developed the Kabbalah, or Cabala, which would be more the Hebrew pronunciation. I only had a half a year of Hebrew in a Catholic seminary, so probably not very good pronunciation on the part of the teachers, but nevertheless. So let's say the Kabbalah began to spread. Why? Because it was considered a holy scripture, even though it was not a holy scripture of the same grade of holiness, shall we say, as the Bible, the Old Testament, the Psalms, and so forth, but it was nevertheless something holy and also something mysterious, for which reasons to our days books have been written, some very good ones, about the religious life of the Kabbalists in various places of Europe. Now, this was, as I say, this was primarily these were Cabalistic notions that were written written down for memory and for memorization by the Cabalistic rabbis, who, in addition to which, were also frequently very much known as miracle workers and magicians, which is the same, because that's the kind of magic that people want more than anything else. You go to a not atheistic countries, and you will find that the people there are engaged in their religious activities for the purpose of getting benefits, let's say, from the other side. Now, let's see, what about Babylonian Kabbalah? Now we know something about Babylon, not only from the followers of the emperor of Ethiopia, but from various other people, wherein it was always understood that there are teachings and practices in Judaism which are secret. They are secret not because other people could not profit by them, but just the contrary, because if unprepared, uninitiated people put their hands on the Kabbalah, it's in all likelihood, or Kabbalah, it's all in all likelihood not going to go with them, because it requires a God-fearing person. It's kind of a little bit, although it's not a very good analogy, as let's say when people join a monastery who are themselves atheists. Doesn't work out too well. Because after all, you're supposed to be there because of a certain divine order and certain divinities, and you're supposed to do what you learn that they want you to do. But if you don't do that, then sort of great discrepancy arises. And so the Jews, being smart people, knew that. They said, well, if we are going to have this special approach to the divine and to divine things, then we also have to be religious. We shouldn't eat any kosher food. We should not various other things. In other words, the Hasidic, which just means a pious one, a Hasid, Hasidim are the pious people, and so they become a special group within the larger mass of Judaism. Then they try to be special, and that is why many of the Hasidic men, even to this day, wear 18th century garb, back to the times when they started. And actually quite nice. As I say, I have the same shoes, and not because of the Hasids, but I have them because they come from another place that is considered by other people holy, from Rome and from the Vatican, because these shoes have been produced by and sold by one of the most famous church goods stores in Rome, Gamarelli, and they just have been making shoes since the 18th or 17th century, and so I've got them on too, because I may not be a rabbi, but I'm something kind of in that general mold. Now then, let's see now, so then that is how the Kabbalah in the West developed. One of its greatest teachers and leaders was well, I mentioned his name before. The leader of the Western Kabbalists, who was the leader of the Kabbalists in the West, and then in addition to that, and pretty much ignored by the pious in the West, they also developed, which something that we didn't know hardly anything about until a few years ago, the Babylonian Kabbalah. The Babylonian Kabbalah simply developed on the territory of ancient Babylon, which is mentioned in the Bible several times, and I dare say in a not terribly laudatory fashion. Why? Because it was mainly developed by Jews who had been moved forcibly from Palestine and from various places, just like they had been moved at another historical period, actually a little bit later chronologically, if we go with the chronologies that the historians have decreed. They were Jews who were taken more or less as slaves, just like they had been taken to Egypt. And the Egyptian slave market involving such prophetic individuals as Joseph and eventually Moses became a very, very important factor in Jewish life. But the kind of Kabbalah that they developed in the West was different. And as you will see, if I am right and not trying to pull your leg, it developed in a certain way because of the prophetic inclination of the wise in Israel, and its developments are still with us, and that is the one I am inclined to refer to this evening. So here I am. We are almost we are sort of halfway into our time, and that's unfortunate because there are some very interesting things here. Now, all right, let me try to add up the factors. The Western Kabbalah, largely based on the teachings of Isaac Luria, Ashkenazi Rabbi Isaac Luria, were based on a symbolic design. Okay? This symbolic design, for reasons that I have never really divined myself, was called and is called the tree of life, or in Yiddish, Etz Chaim. Now, the Etz Chaim was considered to be studied and practiced only by very pious, very religious, and very moral Jewish people. Why? Well, you can ask why, but I think we can give the answer. Because if you're not a good person, you're not going to do very well with religious teachings, religious practices which do not teach and demand such goodness. And we have seen that in various places. There are some people who are very religious in their own tradition, but as the result of that, they feel that they are entitled to a mystical contact with the center of their religion, and that has always been there. And many of them, if they were of the Jewish faith, were Kabbalists. Now, all right. So we are now confronted with the phenomenon of what is in academic scholarship is referred to as the Babylonian Kabbalah. Now, first of all, the Cabalistic teachings in typical Jewish practicality based around the design. And that design in turn has infused into it, by the way of the teaching of the Cabalistic rabbis, with various meanings. And what this amounts to is that the central mystery and we might say the central diagram of the Kabbalah not in the Babylonian but in the West is in a design, in a diagram that is called, heaven knows for what reason, because it doesn't really have a topical relationship to that, the tree of life, Etz Chaim. So the tree of life, which is vaguely, let me see, it is based on a curious twice triangular design. The lower triangle and the higher triangle. And the points of the triangles are placed religious teachings and religious practices. So the top of the Western, the Lurianic Kabbalah is it's a triangle and it's a point. And that point is generally regarded, but as we shall try to suggest to you, perhaps at times incorrectly, as the upper triangle of the Western Kabbalah, also sometimes called the Kabbalah of Nathan of Gaza, who was one of the earlier great Kabbalists, and it is curiously and interestingly, we have to get to that, otherwise you're going to throw stones at me, that in addition to the Western Kabbalah, as we have recently, just within the last few decades, learned, there was another Kabbalah, and this is the Babylonian Kabbalah. Now, how did the Kabbalah come from, I don't know, Poland, where there were a lot of holy rabbis and so forth, to Mesopotamia or Babylonia, the same. Well, they came there because they were Kabbalists, undoubtedly. Now this is, there are some documents that indicate this. And then there are others that are silent about it. But let's say the ones that indicate this, see that the Jews who had been kidnapped from Palestine, from various other countries, and shipped to Babylon, had developed their own kind of Kabbalah. Now the only way I can portray this to you, but I promise you that if you or others whom you know come next time, I will bring this up. I will bring some designs that I can copy that indicates to you the difference between the Lurianic Kabbalah in design and of the Babylonian Kabbalah. And the difference at first doesn't seem so momentous. But if you keep looking at it, keep studying it and meditating on it, then you discover something interesting. The Babylonian Kabbalah, and this has not been said by many, the Babylonian Kabbalah is twice as big as the Lurianic Kabbalah. What does that mean, big? Well, while the Lurianic Kabbalah is portrayed as a structure, or as I said, really either 3 or 4 triangles that are moving upward together. In other words, in the Lurianic Kabbalah, we have 2 triangles, the lower triangle and the higher triangle. They form a triangle because at the points, the 3 points of the triangle are certain vessels. In the Lurianic Kabbalah there are 10 vessels, and which each have a name, each have an angel, have all kinds of magical, mystical qualities associated with them, and therefore meditations and contemplations and artwork that may be based on the Kabbalah are founded on these designs. In the Babylonian Kabbalah, once you discover what it is supposed to look like, you can find that the Babylonian Kabbalah is much larger, and that it is composed of twice the triangles with the vessels at the ends of the Lurianic Kabbalah. So you have a design there that is much, much larger, and that possibly, in terms of the mystical meaning, is also far more valuable and important. Now, why is that so? Because the Babylonian calendar starts out like the Lurianic calendar. The lower triangle and the higher triangle of the vessels leading upwards. And then, at least so we are told, it stops. There's nothing beyond. The Lurianic Kabbalah is like 2 Cabalistic trees of life conjoined. The one reaches up to the second one, and then that is again 2 triangles placed together but going up higher. And our understanding, and certainly ancient Babylonian in their writing is not very frequent, but the scholarly people and the believing Kabbalists feel that the Lurianic Kabbalah indicates one Kabbalah which is composed of 2 triangles moving upward. And this one Kabbalah is the Kabbalah of the created world. If you want to use a Gnostic term, it is created of the world of the demiurge. Even though there are some very nice and very exciting things in it. But then, when you come to the second triangle pointing upward in the Lurianic Kabbalah, then you begin to feel, you begin to experience the second double triangle, which is the Babylonian, and which is purely transcendental and purely mystical. So, when Dion Fortune wrote her really very interesting book, that's a doggone good book, The Mystical Cabala. I don't know whether she was conscious of this, but the mystical Cabala, in contrast to the more mundane Cabala, would be precisely the Babylonian Kabbalah. And why is that so? Because there is nothing else beyond the Babylonian Kabbalah. The Babylonian Kabbalah, in my estimation, and I could be wrong, but I'm not. So the Babylonian calendar indicates another whole tree of life which grows in heaven. The tree of life of the Lurianic Kabbalah grows in earth, and the lowest vessels, Malkut, are symbolized by the earth. But when you come to the Kabbalah of Babylon, the Babylonian Kabbalah is purely on the other worlds. It is purely in an altered state of consciousness. It is purely in a realm that is the realm of, probably on the lowest point, a realm of ghosts and spirits, but as it reaches the middle and the higher realm, it is based on the heavenly world of the divine. Now, what are the conclusions to be drawn from this, if we want to really be honest about it, or we want to be an honest Babylonian Kabbalist? It means that if we pass from the Lurianic Kabbalah to the Babylonian Kabbalah, we have entered and have now permanent acquaintance with the celestial, the transcendental, the divine world. In other words, you want to go to heaven, go with the Lurianic Kabbalah. If you want to stick around at least close to the earth, and you want to delight in the miracle of the computers, then stay in the Lurianic Kabbalah. Now, I think Kabbalists of both persuasions, if there indeed are still both persuasions present, would probably feel that I am overstepping my bounds, which is something that I like to do because it's fun. And so when this, I think it was an insight and not a false vision, came to me, then I said, all right, we have spent about close to 2,000 years with the Lurianic Kabbalah. And if we haven't learned what we can learn there in that period of time, then you might as well give up and join the Mormons or some other Judaizing sect. But if you have the right kind of nose and of being Jewish, they're often, because of the Middle Eastern origins, they are often associated with a large nose. I think that most Arabs that I have known have bigger noses than most Jewish people I have known, but that's just me. But the issue being that from the first double triangle, and I'll give you a design, a primitive design, but it'll help you maybe next time. When you go with the two combined triangles of the Lurianic Kabbalah, then you should be ready to reach the Babylonian Kabbalah. And what do you do there? You have again the two triangles, but they are heavenly triangles. And the higher you move, the closer to the heart of God you will get. In other words, that is the mystical Kabbalah. And making progress on the Babylonian calendar means that you have entered the mystical realm. And therefore, I would say that he took people afflicted with slavery and other unpleasant experiences in Babylon to even consider that. Because you can find a tremendous amount, I can assure you, to some extent from practical experience, that if you really work in prayer, in meditation, in good deeds, in all manner of mystical, magical practice in the lower or Lurianic Kabbalah, then it would seem to me then eventually to kind of outgrow it. Or you tell this to a Kabbalist and they're going to make a gefilte fish out of you, or something of that general nature. But in other words, the Kabbalistic tree of life, the Etz Chaim as we see it in the various books, is half of the job that a good Kabbalist has to do. And how is that? Because when he gets to the Babylonian Kabbalah, then he is moving in the celestial realm. He has moved into transcendence. What has he transcended? He transcended the earlier tree of life. People are going to say that it's sacrilege, for heaven's sakes. Well, it can be handled as such, but it also can be handled like any other ladder. If you keep climbing on it, observing all the rules of the climb, then you are going to end up in a much better way and much better shape than you were before. So there is another tree of life that needs to be considered and that can be practically addressed, and that is, as the result of such addressing, you will find yourself increasingly a transcendental, an angelic, and a prophetic being. So therefore, all of us Kabbalists, because there's a Christian Kabbalah too that has been sort of turned to that end, all of us who have been, so to say, working in the tree of life, you know what? Better get done with it, because there's another one awaiting you. You say, what? Another one? It was terrible enough to try to work this one, which is probably not a bad observation. But if we translate this now into prosaic, non-Kabbalistic terms, then we can find that there is a climbing mechanism, which is the one that Isaac Luria and others have dealt with and wrote their treatises and their prayers about, but they had intimations, or most of them did, that there is yet another one. From that one, that is the river of no return, as the movie said it. Maybe even Marilyn Monroe is there. Wouldn't that be? That would give a few guys an impetus to go there, wouldn't it? But in other words, I feel, I hate to say that I discovered, but I have come to realize the possibility that there is yet another Kabbalah, and that if you climb into that second tree of life, then things are going to go very well with you. You are going to, it's a tree of, just like in the Bible, you have the tree of knowledge, but then you have the tree of life. This The Babylonian Kabbalah is the tree of life. The Lurianic Kabbalah is the tree of knowledge. And that's not Gnostic knowledge, but it's just knowledge. So the issue is that we must keep climbing the tree. If I'm right, then we still have a good deal ahead of us. But secondly, maybe not as far as we think. Not as far as we think. Because probably many of us could be considered to be climbing out of the Lurianic tree of life. We are climbing out of the tree in which we have lived, but we are entering another one. And this other one is heaven. This other one is the kingdom of God, the kingdom of the angels. And only then, when we have climbed that, and when we possibly begin to visualize and see a heaven above a heaven, a God among a God, an angel above an angel, then we have got it made. Which is not a very good expression. But then we have climbed out of the structure. Because both trees of life I would consider, on the basis of my present thought, I would consider to be interactive and interwoven instruments of salvation, instruments of transcendence, instruments of exit from creation and become the creators ourselves. Now, how do I know that? I can't tell you that. But it has come to me, and I have heard and read here and there small indications of this that were present earlier. And so we ought to pay attention to it. Now you say, why Babylonian? Because Babylon is the oldest, not only of the trees of life, but probably the oldest, the most practiced, the most holy, the most transcendental of the instrumentalities of human mysticism. And as such, it would be perfectly understandable and perhaps very good and very exhilarating and great if we did what we can to move from the Lurianic tree of life into the Babylonian tree of life. So our destiny, at least that we can perceive from here, is that other tree of life. We're just touching it on the bottom. But as we touch it, we become more worthy to be in it, and we can do so. And that is what has been happening, what has been going on. For which reason the mystical Cabala, the Cabala which enters the body of God, not just the outer filaments that move around the divine body. That is the one that will take us beyond this world, beyond the world of the demiurge, beyond the world wherein we suffer, into something that will maybe somewhat closer to what in Christendom has been called heaven. So there's still a great distance to go, but the reward is bound to be incredible, unbelievable, tremendous and terrific, joyous beyond all belief. and that is the one that has been regarded as Mount Olympus, as Mount, what's the big Buddhist mountains in Tibet, in other places, which is the highest point that you can go while still having your feet on the earth, but you are now going to where you really belong. Now, you may say that this is fantasy, but you may say that about all mystical teachings and practices. Why? Because we need our fantasy, we need our imagination, as Saint Albertus Magnus called it, in order to get beyond this world, out of this world, into the world which is truly worthy of our presence and which truly will do us the optimum amount of good. Now, details of this can be discussed. For instance, if it is indeed true that what I have been sort of hinting at in several talks, namely that we humans can outgrow our humanity, not out-evolve, as I still don't like evolution, but we can grow with the tree. And finally, we are up at the crown of the tree, where the birds of God are singing, where we will have earned the price that we have been working for thousands of years. It finally has come, but we must work at it. And so maybe some of us will do so. And if we will, the reward, as far as I can conceive of it, is tremendous, is wonderful, it's divine, and maybe I'll get there, folks. Bye.